You are all very, very welcome to this seminar arranged by the two Royal Academies, the Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences and the Royal Academy of Agriculture and Forestry. Also, a very warm welcome to you who follow this seminar at your computer. My name is Inger Andersson, and I have been the chairman of the Division of Biotechnology here at IVA, and I am also chairman in a committee in KSLA, in a committee concerning food chain. But my task today is to take you through this seminar. Both IVA and KSLA are open cross-border meeting points, independent academies to build bridges between society, researchers and politicians, and many, many others. And one important way to do that is to arrange seminars like this tonight. The focus today is for all of us a very important topic. How do we create a sustainable agriculture which both provide sufficient returns to feed on an ever-growing population and where everything is produced in a sustainable way? We are soon 10 billion people at the earth. Last Friday, we were 10 million here in Sweden. Conventional agriculture is producing more and more, but it's not meeting important sustainability targets. Alternative methods, like organic and integrated systems, are better at reaching environmental and socioeconomic goals, but none of these farming systems can on their own supply enough food for the growing global population or ensure sustainable ecosystem. How can scientific advances, farmers' knowledge, and public engagement help the development? Yeah. That's one of the questions, the many questions, which we perhaps got the answers here tonight. First at the floor is the international renowned Professor John Reganold. He's coming all the way from Washington State University. John has more than 180 publications in scientific publications, journals, proceedings, several of them in science and nature. His research has measured the effects of organic, integrated, and conventional farming systems on productivity, financial performance, and environmental quality on 4 continents. So, welcome, Professor John Reganold. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Inga. Can everybody hear me okay? Because I have this headpiece on. I want to thank the Royal Academy of Engineering Sciences and the Royal Academy of Agriculture and Forestry for inviting me. I haven't been to Stockholm for a long time, and I was walking through the old city today, and it's just beautiful, and just walking around new parts of the city, it's a lovely town. So thank you very much. No. Now I'm lost. I don't know how to make this. I want to make it bigger, and I don't see the. Maybe it's that it. Nope. I want to fill the screen, yeah. You don't want to see these? No. I want them to see the full screen, yep. Oh, they do? Oh, okay, great, that works, okay. So I was asked to talk about organic agriculture in the 21st century. And I was invited based on a paper that one of my PhD students and I did in Nature Plants a year ago, where we published a paper looking at the science behind organic agriculture. And there's actually about 40 years worth of scientific publications. There were probably in the mid 70s, early 80s, 10 or 20. And then every decade, more and more, till where today there's probably close to 1,000 comparison studies. Most scientists look at yield comparisons or nutritional differences in food. Some look at the environment. Some look at economics. So we have enough data now to actually make some statements about the sustainability of organic ag. And that's really what I'm going to talk about. Sustainability. I'm going to talk about what the studies show. That's the main part of the talk. And then I'm going to just say a few words about the future of organic farming. So that we're on the same page, we need to understand metrics of sustainable farming. And in general, there are 4: production, environment, economics, and social well-being. By production, we talk about adequate yields of high quality. So good yields, nutritional food. Economics, be profitable, not cost too much. Environmental, be safe, maybe be enhancing the environment. Socially responsible, be good for the family. Have retirement plans for workers, be good for the community. And as we'll find out, to be socially responsible is probably the hardest thing to do. In fact, to meet those 4, it's sort of a utopian concept. For any farm to be sustainable, it needs to be all 4. It can't just be profitable. It can't just produce high yields. It has to be environmental too. How did we get to that definition? In 2010, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, there was a committee of 15 scientists, farmers, and industry scientists that came together and after 2.5 years put out a report that defined those 4 areas. We separated production into its own category. It used to be just economics, the social, and the environmental. Interestingly, FAO before that came up with this term sustainable intensification, which is increasing crop production per unit area and improving environmental, economic, and social sustainability via management of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So not just being sustainable, it's improving all those. It's even harder. But all that said, the definitions are pretty parallel, and so we're going to look at that. The other thing you need to know is, and a lot of consumers don't know this, there's more than just organic and conventional farming. There's a whole bunch of systems that exist out there, and I think a lot of folks think, well, if it's not organic, it's conventional, and if it's not conventional, it's organic. Organic and conventional are like bookends on a shelf. And there are these other systems in between that actually offer promise. Agroecology, for example, especially in subtropical and tropical countries. Number of smallholder farmers around the world practice agroecology. That can be a very impressive system. We have integrated farmers, which are a hybrid of organic. Maybe 70% of the practices follow organic principles, but the other 30% follow conventional principles, where farmers can apply, if they need to, a herbicide, or if they want to add a certain amount of fertilizer, they can do that. But they have to build the soil. In fact, all of these systems in the middle have to build the soil. Mixed crop livestock systems, where people grow crops and animals together. Grass-fed livestock versus feedlot. In the United States, most of our beef and pork are in feedlots. Conservation ag and no-till. Conservation ag is a system of three principles. Optimal conservation ag is where farmers don't plow. They use direct seed drills, so they don't till, no-till. They rotate. Usually, if they're optimal, it's at least 3 years of crop rotations, and they keep the ground covered at all times, so there's no erosion. So those are the systems, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of my talk. Finally, might just want to say a few words. We're talking about organic and conventional farming, so we're talking about those bookends. How's organic farming doing? Well, it's doing pretty well. Over the last 20 years, the number of organic farms, the land area, in other words, the extent of organically farmed land, the amount of research funding, and this is mostly true in developed countries, so Europe, countries in Europe as well as the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the research funding devoted to organic farming has increased, and the market size has increased. A lot of companies are getting involved in this. And so, for example, a lot of European countries, the organic market is usually between 3 and 10% of the total food and beverage market. In the United States, last year it exceeded 5%. So we're pretty big players. I think Europe in general is ahead of us, but we're catching up. Okay, so sustainability metrics. If we were to look at those hundreds of studies that I talked about comparing organic and conventional, do we have enough data to say something about production? Yes. Do we have enough data to say something about economics? Yes. Do we have enough data to say something about the environment? Yes. Social well-being? Not really, because there's only been about a handful of studies comparing the two systems, and part of that is they're difficult to do, but they're starting to get done now. So what do these studies tell us? Let's start with production, looking at the 40 years of data. There have been so many studies looking at yields. Some people look at grain crops, rice, wheat, corn. Some people look at horticultural crops, apples, bananas, oranges. There have been 5 meta-analyses that have brought all those studies together where you can put all those crops in the computer, compare apples with oranges, with meat, and you get an idea about yield. When you do that, those 5 studies, the range is that organic crops are 8 to 25% lower in yield than conventional. Now, we could cherry pick data. I could find a study where organic is 50% higher. I could find a study where conventional is 70% higher. In general, it's 8 to 25%. Organic does better with some crops than with others. The one crop it tends not to do well in is wheat. It does fairly well with corn. There are studies with corn show about an 8% difference, where organic is about 8% less. If you take into effect that some of these grain farmers have to grow green manure crops, so they're growing a crop that they're going to till under, like a clover, an alfalfa, then the yields can even be lower. But at the same time, in doing that, they're stewarding the land. They're benefiting the soil with all the organic matter that they're adding to it. So there are pluses to that. If we are to move forward with organic, if it's going to grow, it does better under certain agroecological conditions, certain environmental conditions. So for example, where I come from in the Palouse, eastern Washington, about 1 million hectares of agricultural land, it's rolling hills. It's really tough to do organic there because you have to use the plow. It's very difficult to do no-till with wheat. We grow a lot of wheat. Conservation farming and no-till work pretty well there to preserve the soil. So it might be in those instances, agroecological conditions there, it's better to use no-tillage. It is true, under less favorable soil conditions, like drought, as an example, organic yields can be equal or greater. Why is that? Under dry conditions, organic soils have more organic matter, they hold more water. They're going to give that water up to the plant. So under a drought, there's more water in the soil for the plant. So yields do well there. There's also some studies that show that, and breeders have been working on this mainly with grains, that, for example, if you directly select wheat, this is an example, that's been grown in an organic system, varieties grown in that system tend to do better in organic systems than in a conventional system, and vice versa. And most of the wheat, most of the crops that we produce are grown and bred in conventional systems. So there may be a rationale for breeders to actually breed crops, certain crops, under organic conditions to help improve those yields. That would help close the yield gap. Crop quality. Little to no pesticide residues are found on organic foods. There have been at least 5 or 4 reviews or meta-analyses done in this area. And that seems pretty obvious. The organic ag does use pesticides, but in general, we don't have the same arsenal of pesticides that conventional has. And also they, in general, are probably a little bit more benign. So in that sense, organic does better. There have been studies in the United States and other places where they actually have given children conventionally produced food, and they measure pesticide metabolites and residues in their urine. They give them organic food, and those basically go away, or they're at a very low level. They come back and they give them conventional food and they appear again. Now, although data show that organic foods may prevent some clear advantages in not having the residues, the human health impacts of long-term pesticide exposure from food, that is not clear. We're still, because we're the guinea pigs, it's very difficult to do long-term studies. However, if parents are concerned about their kids being overexposed to pesticides, you can buy organic food. And there are certain vegetables that have more residues than others, and you can actually go online. Environmental Working Group has some data on pesticide residues, ewg.org, and you get an idea of what fruits and vegetables have little and what have more. Crop quality. This is probably the most contentious area, and it's also the most popular. For some reason, people want to talk about the nutrition of organic food. Personally, I want to talk about the environmental effects, and we haven't got to that yet. But there have been probably about 300 studies done in this area comparing, say, organic carrots with conventional carrots. So much so that starting in the year 2000, we started getting review studies and meta-analyses like I was talking about with yields. And when you look at that, 14 of the 17 studies show that organic food, there is evidence that it has more nutrition. And this would be with produce, grains, milk, and meat. It just depends on what was emphasized. These 14 studies in general show higher concentrations of vitamin C, total antioxidants, and total omega-3s. 3 of the studies concluded there were no consistent differences. One of those 3 found that conventional chicken and pork had about a 33% higher risk for contamination with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So that's what the data show. If you're concerned about nutrition, it leans toward organic food. Environmental quality. Let's start with the soil. Organic systems have better soil quality and less erosion. Now we're comparing organic with conventional. We're not comparing organic with no-till or agroforestry. And that makes sense because organic farmers are adding a lot of organic matter to the soil. It improves the soil quality. There have been studies done that show organic farming leaves the soil more aggregated, less erodible state. Some people argue that when you farm lands organically, the soil's healthier, it's better to pass down to future generations, our children, our grandchildren, etc. So from a soil viewpoint, it's pretty clear, the evidence is pretty clear favoring organic over conventional. Then we get into areas like pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and energy use. Well, I mentioned before organic ag because it doesn't use synthetic pesticides in general. The risk of polluting ground and surface waters is minimal, so it's going to have less risk in that area. When you get into nitrate and phosphorus leaching and greenhouse gas emissions, organic systems score better than conventional when you express it per unit land area. If you say, well, let's express it per yield, per unit crop, because conventional gets higher yields, the difference is less pronounced. In general, it still favors organic, but in some cases, it ties or it reverses itself. When it comes to energy, the studies that we looked at and the meta-analyses that we looked at, and this was from 14 for all of these, energy efficiency is greater for organic systems. Organic farmers use less energy than conventional farmers. When it comes to biodiversity, organic farms have higher below and above ground biodiversity. We're not just talking about birds, fauna, pollinators, predators. We're talking about soil microorganisms, things, earthworms, things below. You have to look at both. Organic farms tend to have more landscape diversity, and that's good. So to sum it up, environmental quality is really favored in the organic system. Financial performance. A colleague and I were sitting around a few years ago realizing that there had not been a meta-analysis done over the last 40 years looking at all the economic studies that had been done. So we decided to do this, and we published it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. And our meta-analysis assessed all the economic data comparing organic with conventional for 55 crops grown on 5 continents over 40 years. This is what we found. Under actual conditions with price premiums, organic farmers get price premiums. They get more money for their crop. Organic ag was significantly more profitable. Looking at net returns, economists look at net present values. 22 to 35% more profitable. If you don't like that, let's look at benefit cost ratios, 20 to 24% higher with organic food. If you take away, and this is hypothetical, the organic premiums, then of course conventional, because of the higher yields, is going to be more profitable. And so it loses when you take away the premiums. The premiums are what keep it in the game. So what are those premiums? Premiums average about 30%. The funny thing is, and this surprised us, that premium has held constant over the 40 years. It's been about 30%. This is not the premium that you and I pay when we go to the store. We look at organic apples compared to conventional apples. That's our premium. This is the premium that the farmer gets. It's called the farm gate premium, and that averages about 30%. Then you might say, well, how much does the farmer really need to match conventional profits? About 6%. Getting 30 needs 6, but the organic farmer could argue, hey, I'm providing all these environmental benefits. I think it's worth it. We're going to get to that in a minute. Our study also showed yields were 10 to 18% lower, so it fit within that 8 to 25% range that I talked about that those other studies had. How about total cost? The same. Costs are the same, but labor costs are more expensive, 7 to 13% more for organic farmers. Well, then why would total cost be the same? Because the cost of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides are higher than the organic fertilizers and pesticides used. Now, these profits didn't account for externalities or ecosystem services. Okay, so What are those? There have been a few economic studies, and only a few, like on my hand, that have accounted for negative externalities. Those are costs to the environment, like nitrate leaching, like soil erosion. There's also positive externalities, which we more or less now term ecosystem services, things that benefit us. So if we put a price on negative externalities, it would raise the profitability of organic, because I just went through that litany of all those different environmental factors where organic farming does better. So it would become more profitable. A scientist in his group in England years ago, it was probably about 10 years ago, took this a step further and said, gee, if the entire, and this was all hypothetical, if the entire United Kingdom shifted to organic, just looking at external costs and externalities, that the external cost would be lowered by 75% if the entire country shifted to organic. Now, the person didn't look at, well, what would happen to the food supply, economics of export. This was just externalities. And so that was interesting, 75% reduction in negative effects on the environment. If we go the opposite direction, we look at ecosystem services, which are really what we're doing today. It's more popular, and it should be. What are the benefits that we're getting from farming? Like, are there biological pest controls, predatory beetles and wasps that provide biological control, soil biota, microbes in the soil that are benefiting us with nutrient cycling, helping us with soil quality. There have been about 4 studies done where they take some of those into account, and it shows that organic practices increase the ability of farms to provide some economically significant ecosystem services. And if you factor in those ecosystem service benefits, it more than makes up for the price premium. So it kind of justifies that 30%. In fact, it might even be greater than that. Here we get to the gray area. Both organic and conventional farming need to make significant progress to meet social sustainability goals. I was in a room once with some wine grape growers. I sort of consider there's agriculture and then there's viticulture. Viticulturists are always so happy because they're producing wine, and we all love wine. And it was with about 15 different wine grape growers from all around the world, and they were talking about all the sustainability stuff they did. It was a 3-day workshop, and at the end of the workshop, one of the farmers got up and said, "How many of you have 401k plans for your workers? That's a retirement plan." Nobody raised their hands. When you do that, you are sustainable. And I just sat there because I was the only scientist in the room, and I was shocked. It was like, wow. So there have been some limited studies that show organic farming has some sociocultural strengths. There have been studies that show positive shifts in community economic development. There are some increased social interactions between farmers and consumers, and there's greater employment of farm workers with organic systems. Organic farming reduces the exposure of farm workers to pesticides and other chemicals, and that's particularly important in less developed countries. So that's a plus. Organic certification programs around the world are starting to adopt social well-being goals, so they're moving in that direction, and I think that's good. Organically certified animals must have access to some open air and grazing whenever possible. Sick animals have to be treated with antibiotics. There's a fallacy that they don't do that. They have to do it. They have to pull the animal out and put it in the conventional herd. They can't bring it back. We have farmers markets. We have community-supported ag enterprises, CSAs, where people get food. They go to the farm, buy food baskets every week, or they have it delivered to their house. Those are mostly organic. Those are increasing. That's all good stuff. But bottom line is we still have a long way to go. So One of the things Jonathan Walker and I did, that's my PhD student, we put all this together in our nice flower diagram. And so these are 12 petals on a flower. And it kind of summarizes what I just talked about, the different metrics. It doesn't cover everything, but it covers most everything. And you really want a flower to have equal petals. Most scientists want that. I think most farmers would like that too. So you don't want to just produce high yields, or you don't want to just make a lot of money. You want to have a balance. And if you look at the organic flower, you look at the petals, they have a ways to go. The conventional has a ways to go too. It has less far to go with yields, but it has further to go with the environment, further to go with social and economics. And so when you put it all together, organic systems are more balanced, and they present us more with a true flower. Okay, what about the future? I get this question. People ask me this. So now you don't have to ask me this, because I'm going to tell you ahead of time. You can't ask me this. But I've been in rooms where someone will stand up and they'll say, well, organic farming can't feed the world. Well, and I sit there and go, well, conventional farming can't feed the world. No one system can feed the world alone. But our best hopes are for these more integrated systems, which I'll get to. Does organic farming, does it have a role to play? Sure. Right now, organic farming occupies about 1.5% of all the cropland in the world. Why can't that be 10? Maybe 15% by 2050, 2060. Yes, and so can other innovative farming systems. That National Academy report and FAO have had a number of articles saying, hey, look, conservation ag puts out a better flower than conventional. Integrated farming, where you blend the two systems, puts out a better flower. Agroforestry. So there are these other systems that are more innovative that we can go to. What they have in common, and I'm biased because I'm a soil scientist, is that they all build the soil. It really starts with the soil. And if you start there, it's pretty hard to go wrong. I mean, you still can go wrong. And just because you're organic, or just because you're a conservation ag farmer, or just because you're integrated, you can be good at all those, or you can be not so good. So you got to be good to be sustainable. So we want good farmers to follow these more innovative systems. I mentioned no one farming system will safely feed the planet. It's going to be a blend of these systems. Someone should just get up and say, hey, it's organic, integrated, conservation farming, mixed crop livestock, agroforestry. They're going to feed the world, and they're our best hope. And there will be systems we don't even know about yet that we're designing that can really help out. So then you might say, wait a minute, existence of innovative systems that I just talked about, they're around, and they are growing slowly. But what's inhibiting their growth? Well, three main things. Markets, policy incentives. So like in the United States, it would be the Farm Bill. That's one of them. Here it might be here, and when I say here, I'm talking about not just Sweden, but in other European countries, it might be policies that award crop subsidies. Uneven development and availability of scientific information. Those things hinder, and they also guide farmer decisions. They have a big effect on what farmers decide. Also, consumers have a lot to say, what we buy at the market. We're producing more than enough food right now for 7.4 billion. More than enough. And we waste about 30% on average. I think most of you know that. Waste 30% in developed countries, waste 30% in less developed countries, but for different reasons. Still about 30%. We could reduce that. Let's reduce that to 15%. We could eat a more plant-based diet. There have been studies done, in fact, a recent one last year that looked at all these different diets that basically said our best hope is a plant-based diet. You can eat some meat, but less of it. In the United States, we may be the worst culprits. We should be showing the way. Why do I say that? In the United States, 71% of adult Americans, that's 20 years and older, are overweight or obese. I did not say 20%. I said 71%. So let's just say 2/3. We don't want the world to do that. Follow that example. If we ate more plants, we'd be better off. Finally, I'll end my talk with what kind of agriculture do we want? I have to show you a picture of some soil. These two samples taken from the Midwest, southern Minnesota, were taken from two farms that were side by side. A colleague of mine took these, growing corn. The farm on the left, you see the roots hanging there with no soil, and you can see the corn stalk, was basically corn, corn, corn. Once in a while, corn, soybean. Not much of a rotation. Very conventional, highly intensive. The farm on the right was integrated. About 80% of the practices were organic, but the farmer could come in, give a shot of herbicide if he wanted to. Also would have animals graze. When the farmer was growing alfalfa, the farmer was in a 4-year rotation: corn, soybean, alfalfa, alfalfa. Alfalfa is a great soil builder. My friend took those samples with a shovel, ran a garden hose, not like a fire hose, just at moderate flow, and within 30 seconds, all the soil washed away from the roots on the conventional. The soil stayed intact with the integrated because of more organic matter, more binding agents, more microbes holding it together. That's the kind of agriculture I want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Are there any? Yes? Use the microphone because the people following the seminar is in front of you. It's in front of you.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting speech. I just wanted to know, in the context of the sustainability development goals, how do you look at this with the water issue, the availability of water becoming more and more problematic?
Well, yeah, and it is, and it's the drought situation in many countries is more of an issue. And that actually supports these more innovative systems because these innovative systems are building the soil. So they're adding organic matter. When you do that, organic matter holds water. It's like a sponge. So you want more organic matter in the soil. It's going to hold more water. It's going to release it to the plant. It's also going to create a surface that's better structure. Water can actually infiltrate, get into the soil. It doesn't run off and cause erosion. So having these soils formed under innovative systems is our best hope. However, that said, even after a while, if we continue to keep having drought, we only can do so much. We can have drought-resistant varieties, and that certainly helps. But we get to a point where if it continues and continues, obviously our yields could suffer if it happens again and again and again. So that the water issue scares me. Yeah.
There we have another one. Please, do you find the microphone? Yes?
Thank you very much. My question is, do you see a role for really advanced technology in increasing the yields or the quality of organic products in farming, or at least in those in-between stages?
Okay, I just want to get, was your question, do I see a role for biotechnology?
Yeah.
Well, right now, actually, biotechnology plays a role with marker-assisted selection is biotechnology, and some of the crops that are bred with marker-assisted selection, because it's not transgenic, can actually be used in organic systems. That question is really for people who sit on these organic certification panels. And right now, the word is that for organic systems that are certified and biodynamic, there can be no GMOs. It can't be transgenic. I don't know what's going to happen with CRISPR. That's a little bit different. And actually, it's you know, if you look at some of the transgenic crops that have come on in the United States, and you look at some of the classically bred crops, they both take to get to market to a farmer. You think, oh wow, that breeder's doing such a good job. We're going to have that crop out next year. It takes 10 to 12 years. 10 to 12 for either one. So, and some of the classically bred stuff does a great job, but you could hypothetically say, could transgenics, could CRISPR, could all these help? Sure. It's whether or not they want to allow it in their system. The other side of the coin is, again, we're asking about yield. Well, gee, can conventional do better with the environment? That's the question I have. Come on, let's do that. It's not just a yield question. I want to hear a farmer say, hey, I got this great yield this last year, but you know what? I protected my soil, I built it, and I made money, and I provided jobs for my 3 workers. That's what I like to hear, and I rarely hear that.
A last question, and then we continue. Do you have the microphone? Can you find it?
You have a long and continuous perspective.
Yes.
If you look back over these 4 years, is there something in the forecast that have been given that stands out as on yield, for instance, or on whatever, that were less good or bad than anticipated? Are we going in a certain direction, would you say?
Oh, you mean for the future? Yeah, I mean, there's some bigger issues at play here. So someone brought the question up about water. Obviously, you're referring to climate change. Nutrient pollution is a big issue. Biodiversity loss globally is huge. That may be the biggest issue. So we face those, and we're trying to grow more food. I'm probably right in the middle, a little bit more optimistic than pessimistic. I think in some ways, Americans in general, a little bit more, we're kind of greedy. And I include myself in that. And we need to back off, do more plant-based. I'm very hopeful organic and integrated systems are increasing. 10, 15 years ago, I had farmers say, a few farmers said to me, I can't do the organic. I won't get that premium. It's still holding. The demand, we cannot meet the demand in the United States. Europe has that same problem for many crops. So I think it's going to keep growing on and on. The bigger issue, can we get all these systems going to help us? And it's happening. Is it happening fast enough? I don't know.
Once again, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
We continue. To create sustainable agriculture requires efforts from researchers, politicians, legislators, as I have mentioned before. Plant breeding is gradually improving varieties that can be grown with higher yields, better qualities, and better resistance to diseases and pests. Modern biotechnology, for example, CRISPR-Cas9, as we mentioned just before, can strongly contribute, but the use of modern biotechnology is associated with difficulties such as lack of clarity in the law and is not accepted in all contexts in society. A well-known person in this area is Professor Stefan Jansson, Umeå University. 2015, he published the book Beyond GMOs, Science and Plant Breeding for Sustainable Agriculture, and written together with, for us in Sweden, two well-known persons, Torbjörn Fagerström and Roland von Bottmer. And I will say also the book was an initiative from another Royal Academy, the Royal Academy of Sciences. Stefan is also a board member of the Mistra Biotech, which is a research project which mission is to conduct research in modern biotechnology and plant breeding. And actually, the last years was Stefan Jansson probably the first to cultivate CRISPR-Cas9 cabbage, and he did it in his own garden. And even more, when the cabbage was grown up, he tasted it with the journalists in various TV and radio programs. So, welcome. The floor is yours, Stefan.
Thank you. Yeah. I have a few slides about the CRISPR at the end and the meal here. So I'm really honored to be here to talk to you about this. It's actually a bit strange to talk about plant breeding because I'm not a plant breeder myself. I'm a basic scientist working with photosynthesis and natural variation in trees. But for various reasons, I get more and more into this debate. And maybe it's not necessary to you, but at least I still would like to point out the immense importance of plant breeding. I would like to say, maybe without plant breeding, we would never have been sitting here from the right now. If humans would have been fishers and hunters, we can never build a town. Frankly, I mean, you need to have a efficient way of producing food so that you can gather around. And Sweden was up to a couple thousand years ago populated by fishers and hunters. And the only reason why there were Germanic tribes coming up here, slowly bringing agriculture with them. And that's why we can make towns, we can make a capital, Stockholm, we can make universities and all these kind of things, because we have been able to do agriculture. And I'm showing this picture here because this is, in fact, my own garden. It used to be my own garden. Maybe I can proudly say that I started back in the 70s to grow my own vegetables under conditions which now would be said be organic. I mean, no chemical fertilizers and so on. And but why I'm showing this to say that in my garden and in every other garden, in every other agricultural system in Sweden, you will never, with the exception of apples and black currants, and you will never find a plant that you can find in Sweden in the wild. Everything has been brought here because these are foreign species that has been adapted to our very special climate with very short seasons and very long day length. So unless the pre-Vikings actually have done plant breeding, we would never have been sitting here from the beginning. And you could even put it that the speed by Sweden was colonized by agriculture. That had to do with how quick they could change their flowering time of barley, because that was the determining factor, whether they could make agriculture in Söderköping or Gävle or Umeå. But of course the Vikings, they didn't understand, they didn't even have a word for plant breeding. But still they were doing it, because up to, I would say, 150 years ago, humans have been doing plant breeding without having a clue what they were doing. They have been going out, sowing seeds every spring, harvesting in the autumn. And every time they did this, they could make a small step in plant breeding. I used to illustrate that by talking about cabbage. Cabbage is a species that is wild, growing in southern Europe. And do I have a pointer somewhere? So wild cabbage at the top. It actually doesn't taste very good. But already the Romans, they were eating cabbage. Brassica, it's the Latin name for. Once upon a time, probably a couple of thousand years ago, there was a farmer, maybe somewhere to Belgium of today, that found a brassica that couldn't make their branches. You should have branches with flowers on. But if you had a mutation in the gene that was supposed to make branches, then instead you get some little balls. He thought that was good, and then he kept the seeds of that one, and now we eat the offspring of that as Brussels sprouts. Somewhere else there was another farmer that happened to find a brassica that couldn't instead of making a long stem, it was swelling up as a ball. That's kohlrabi. Cauliflower, that was supposed to be a big stalk of flowers. Now it's actually making a tumor here, not even normally accumulating chlorophyll. This is an extremely strange structure, but we eat it because we think it's good. All these things, that's the same species, only single gene mutations that have happened there. And they've been selected by farmers without knowing anything about plant breeding. But this is the basis of agriculture today. And again, nothing that we eat is, nothing that we cultivate in Sweden is found wild in Sweden. And really basically nothing is found wild anywhere if you really look today. So, and we all are dependent on this, regardless of whether we do conventional farming or whether we do organic farming. Actually, just copied here, every spring you need to buy new seeds. This is from, I shouldn't tell the company where I'm buying seeds from, but anyway. You can see this is a seed catalog, in this case cucumber. The blue ones, that's the organic seeds that you can buy. They are a bit more expensive and so on, but I won't talk about that. But what is really clear here, you will find here a list of markers to say that, okay, these are the different viruses, the different bacteria, and the different fungi that's affecting this. Everyone is need plants that are not getting diseases, regardless of whether you're organic farmers or conventional farmers. Or I would argue you would need them even more if you're an organic farmer, because then you're restricted in your use of pesticides. So you could really say that farmers, they take chemistry when breeding fails to deliver the resistant varieties. It's only when breeders don't do what they are supposed to do. Constantly there is plant breeding in order to get the more and more resistant genotypes. But then there is on the other side are the pathogens and the insects. They are all the time evolving on their side, overcoming the resistance that the breeders are putting in there. And when the pathogens and when the insects are winning, then farmers have to do something to protect their crops. So, but I was talking about breeding and I was talking about genes. Maybe I should quickly remind you, what is a gene, really? A gene is a piece of DNA in a chromosome. We have DNA, plants, or every living organism has DNA. And of course you know that, for instance, eye color, that's something which is genetically determined. You who have brown eyes, you in fact has a gene somewhere in your genome which is producing a protein that is producing a brown pigment in your iris. That's why you have a brown eye. I have blue eyes, I have a mutation in that particular gene, so I don't produce any of that protein, so then I can't get the brown color. So this is how genes are working. Either they are producing something, then you get the one substance somewhere in a plant or an animal or a human, or they don't do it. Mutations and so on. And this is why selecting some of these mutations, that's what happened during brassica breeding and barley breeding and so on. But up to 150 years ago, when Gregor Mendel was sitting in his monastery garden in Brno and counting peas, no one understood this. No one had a clue how this was working. They didn't even have a word for it. But he understood it, and he made the basis of scientific plant breeding. And since then, plant breeding has been enormously much more efficient than it used to be before Gregor Mendel. In fact, it took only 50 years after, or a little bit more, in the 1930s and 1940s, plant breeders realized that, okay, we have a lot of variation out there. We can wait for spontaneous mutations to happen. But we could, in fact, induce mutations. We can increase the speed of evolution by treating them with different things to gain more mutations. And the most popular ones, which are still used today, that is radiation breeding or chemical mutagenesis breeding. With radiation breeding, you take seeds, you expose them to radioactivity. This is one of the big institutes in Japan where they do this. Or you treat them with chemicals that for us are cancerogenic because they are causing mutations, which may make our genes go crazy and create cancer. But when you treat the plants in this way, they will also go crazy, most of them. This will make DNA get damaged and so on. 99% of but perhaps 99.99% of these mutations, they are deleterious. So you don't need them, and they are discarded in the breeding process. But here and there, you find something which is useful, and that is what's been kept. And almost, I wouldn't say everything, but I think the majority of the food that you're eating today, they have been through these breeding programs. My favorite is actually red grapefruit. You know, red grapefruit. All grapefruit used to be yellow up to the point when someone was exposed to the radiation. It lost a little bit of DNA. It started to look better because it was red and was a bit more sweet. And we all like it, so that's why it's taken over the market. So if you're assuming that you have a plant, you have DNA, and you expose it to radiation, what could happen is really, if I get this animation to work, that radiation hits the DNA, you get a break, the DNA is in two pieces. That sounds like a bad idea, so that's for the plant. So then there has a lot of repair system that takes the two pieces and puts them together. And the only thing that happens at the end is that they miss little pieces in the middle. And that's, again, what's happening with the red grapefruit. This, of course, there is no direction in this. You just do it randomly, and pieces and bits and pieces of DNA everywhere, and each of the chromosomes are disappearing. And then you just try to find the good ones. And this was one of the ways that plant breeders worked for many years and are still working. However, there was a really major breakthrough in the 80s when scientists learned that, well, there is a bacterium out there, agrobacterium, that in its natural life cycle has the capacity to transfer some pieces of its DNA into the plant genome. So the agrobacterium is a natural-born gene manipulator. In its natural habitat, it transfers genes into plants. And we as scientists, we can sort of capture this system. So if we take the agrobacterium, we take away the genes that the agrobacterium put in there, because agrobacterium, that causes tumors in plants. We don't want that. If we take away those genes and then we make the gene that we would like to put in there, then we let the agrobacterium do the job, and then we can produce plants that have novel genes in them. It used to be quite complicated. If we work our favorite plant for basic plant biology, it's called Arabidopsis. If we make a transgenic Arabidopsis, we just take the bacterium, we add a little soap, we dip the plant down, take it up, and then we have a transgenic plant. Everyone can do it home in their kitchen if they want, if they had the right equipment. So, and why is now this so useful for plant breeders? Well, there are two things. The most important thing is that you can work with one gene at a time and one trait at a time. And I illustrate this with the potatoes. You know, the major threat for potato growing throughout the world, that's Phytophthora, late bly, causing bladmögel and brunröta in Swedish. It's a pest that has been devastating for potato breeders everywhere. There are, of course, resistance genes towards these ones in the natural potato populations in South America. They have been found elsewhere also. These ones is actually a group of potato cultivars, this sharp, I think they are Hungarian from the beginning. These are naturally resistant to, because they have these resistance genes that make Phytophthora not able to attack them. But you probably have never seen these ones in the supermarket stores. You can buy them. The problem is that these ones, they yield too little. They may only yield half, at least in Sweden, of the other varieties. So then the organic farmer has to choose, okay, if it's a good year, I won't get bly. So then I will get twice as much yield if I take another variety, not one of these ones, if I take King Edward or something, which is good. If there is a bad year, then you get attacked, and then you get the yield reduction. Could be even more than 50%. And then he needs to make money, and he makes some balance there. And typically it ends up that he needs to take the other ones, because it's too risky. You can't actually work with a crop that has too little yield. And so this is all the time the balance. And here, so even though there are resistance genes, they are coupled, because if you do breeding, you can not only bring in one gene, you bring in a lot of other genes from the other variety. So you cannot just take sort of King Edward and make it resistant. Maybe you could, but it will take 50 or 100 years. But you could do it with with biotechnology, because then you only take the gene that confers resistance and then brings it in. But then it's becoming a GMO, because then you have to do it with agrobacterium. And then, in reality, you're not allowed to use it. There is a variety that was field tested in Sweden now 11 years ago, which is fully resistant. Still, it's not used. And we'll come back to that later, because there is no one can get a permit to use it. It would make Sweden's potato production completely without the use of chemical pesticides. So that's one thing you can do. You can do one trait at a time. But there also is the possibility that you can introduce genes that are not there at all in the pool of plants that you can cross with each other. And that's what happened with cotton, for instance. Cotton has a devastating pest. It's a cotton bollworm that is sort of living inside the cotton boll and eating it. And that's a really big problem for cotton growers. In order to get resistance from that one, then you actually use the substance that also coming from organic farming. Organic farmers, they used to put Bacillus thuringiensis on the crops, sometimes to protect it from insects, because this bacterium is producing a toxin that is killing the insects. Now you take the gene from bacteria and then you let the cotton ball instead produces the very same protein. And then of course you get protection against this one. So unless you are buying organic cotton, I can more or less bet that everything that you're dressed on is cotton that has been bred with this extra gene for Bt, because it means that the farmers don't need to spray to control this one. So there are all these breeding techniques, sorry, this is in Swedish, that was developed from back in the 1880s. And all of these ones are put there in green, because they are producing plants, normal plants. But the one up there in red, that's the one, this agrobacterium that I showed you. Because when this technique was invented back in the 80s, there were a lot of concerns that maybe there are some unknown problems here. Maybe we would create something which is dangerous. So then society decided that we need to have a special rule, special laws to regulate this. And they only cover up to this particular techniques. Anything else was excluded. So to grow any other plant whatsoever, you need absolutely no permit. You can go into any garden shop, buy new seeds, and you don't ask the authorities for permit to sowing in your garden. But if that one would be covered under this definition of a genetically modified organism, then in reality it's forbidden to use in Europe. And since then the debate is going on. There are people who've been worried, people have been against this. They actually can be against it because there's a definition. If someone would be against red grapefruits, it's very hard to... I mean, there is no legal framework about that. That's just plant breeding and a lot of different techniques. But there was once a definition said that this is a GMO and that falls under this. So people have been protesting, and still there are differences in different parts of the world. Europe is maybe the most negative towards this. And you all have seen these things. And I said this was 30 years ago, and by now there's been enormous amount of science done on this ones. Science know for sure that breeding using agrobacterium is no less risky than breeding with all other techniques. There's probably nothing in the world which has been so many scientific studies on showing exactly the same thing. If you would, for instance, find out if it's toxic with toothpaste, then you may do 1, 2, 5 studies, 10 studies, and then you sort of get bored because you find this. There was no problem. Here, that has not happened. So here, science keep on producing studies after and after each other, showing that there is no bigger risk. No one can say that there is no risk, but there is no bigger risk with this than all other techniques. And yet, EU has been unable to change this legislation. And it is really kind of a conundrum, because you say you have some plants here that are GMOs and all others are not. If you would like to change this definition, if you would like to change the definition here, then people will get so angry, so that has been politically impossible. If you would like to change the definition in the other direction, we would have nothing to eat. so then it's been sort of a deadlock for 15 years like this. So already, also now, in reality, at least in Europe, GMOs are not allowed outside the lab. Although science says there is no more risk with this one. And that's have been the situation for a long time. And I've been arguing about this in public for many years. And I said, we've been studying for many years a particular gene called PSPS. We used to say it's a safety valve in photosynthesis, because if you shine too much light on plants, they want to get rid of the excess energy, and then they use this PSPS. So we published on this in both Nature and Science 15 years ago. And at that time, we had a mutant generated by radiation, where the PSPS gene was missing. And that was the whole breakthrough. Finally, we had a plant lacking this protein, then we could do science on it. But that's not a GMO. When we published that paper, then of course the editors, the reviewers, you need to confirm this. You need to confirm that you have not hit just another gene because you do this randomly. So then we had to make a GMO of to prove that we were right. So for us in science, these ones are identical or equivalent. But in terms of legislation, one is a GMO, not allowed anywhere, and one is a non-GMO, allowed to grow by anyone, anywhere, without any restriction. Which is, to most of us, nuts, but that's the way it is. But CRISPR, you may have heard this is a technique partially invented here in Sweden, in fact in Umeå, where you can actually direct the cuts of DNA in a very precise way. I shouldn't go into the details here, but here we could in fact say, okay, we shouldn't do this cuts by random. We say we cut here and we cut there, and then when the plant repairs it, this little piece will disappear. And yeah, the plant will do just as it did with these random mutations. So we actually 2 years ago sat down to design a plant where we sort of mimicked the radiation-induced mutation. We were controlling and making a cut. We actually did it much smaller because the ones that we had up there, it was lacking not only this gene, it was lacking some other genes. We'll make it more precise. And then, so we got the same thing, a plant without PSPS, and then we went to the authorities and said, okay, is this a GMO or not? It may sound like a small question, but it actually is an immense importance for mankind, I would say, because if this would be a GMO, this would mean that this technique would in reality not be possible to use. If it would be not a GMO, anyone could use it anywhere without any restriction. And it can't be half a GMO. Either it has to be a GMO or not, inside or outside. And the authorities, they were sitting there thinking about this for quite some time, and finally in November 2015, they came with a ruling against the will of the European Commission, because they said, we want to take this decision, but they never did it, years after year. So then the Swedish Board of Agriculture said, okay, if you do it like this, if you only take a piece away, there's no new DNA added, it's identical to something that could have been generated by radiation, then it can't be a GMO. And that, of course, we asked for this PSPS-less plant, but the implication is, of course, for every plant. If you do this, and only do it, cut and paste like this, take away pieces, we don't even have to ask anyone for a permit because it's not a GMO. And that's why I could, last summer, grow here the cabbage seeds in my garden. And actually took in this pallkragar to get it. You see, in a way, I'm playing here with sort of the difference between high technology and really. So I was even using organic pots here. And at the end, I cooked it and then ate it with the journalists. And we announced this as probably the first CRISPR meal in history. We don't know it because maybe someone has done it in the past without being stupid enough like me telling others. But actually, so far, no one has stood up afterwards and said that we have already done it. In fact, there was an article in New York Times only 2 weeks ago claiming that the first CRISPR meal was eaten in a fancy restaurant. Not CRISPR, that was another genome editing technique, but fancy restaurant in Manhattan in October. But they were wrong because they were actually mailed the journalist. He was very embarrassed because this has, I mean, it was Odla med P1 who got the scoop, and I presented it in a blog here and so on, and even put the recipe out there for those who wanted. So, and it had this was my 15 minutes of fame. So Science made one article about it 3 days later. They mentioned it in 3 other articles since then. Now I have a list of about 250 articles in 38 different countries throughout the world where they have reported this. Yesterday it was in corresponding to Plus in Germany. They were doing the same and so on. So, and okay, is this serious or not? Well, I think it's damn serious because it really has to do whether we are allowed to use biotechnology or not in future farming in Europe. And I think, and most scientists think, okay, if we do something which is identical to something which is non-GMO, you can't regulate it as a GMO. But there are very strong voices on the other side. This is a letter from Greenpeace, Friends of Earth and others, fiercely lobbying to the European Commission to say that this has to be regulated under the GMO rules also in Europe, because it is as dangerous as GMO. The difference here is whether you think that GMOs are dangerous in the first place. If you believe that they are dangerous, then this is as dangerous. If you don't believe, as science does, that it's not dangerous, then of course there is no difference. But now this is still ongoing. It will be the European Court of Justice that eventually will decide this. But to end this, I need to say that what frustrates me a lot, maybe I will with discussing this beforehand, because for me as a scientist that would like to use science for plant breeding, then the organic sector is actually my enemy. Because in Sweden and in Europe, the organic sector has been one of the strongest lobbyists against this, against GMOs and against the use of CRISPR. You may ask why, because why don't they want plants that are resistant and don't need sprayings and so on? Yeah, well, maybe they won't. But as you pointed out, they put there in the definitions that they are not allowed to use them. And then you come in this very intricate situation, because maybe they want agriculture with less chemicals. But now, if you would allow a blight-resistant potato in conventional farming, if you have to produce half as many potatoes per hectare in organic farming, how could you actually motivate that someone will buy it for twice of the price if there is less chemicals in the conventional one? And this is really the conundrum. And I hope this will change, but actually I don't see any signs at the moment. But maybe this, because this CRISPR, what it's actually doing is sort of is breaking up this division between non-GMOs and GMOs. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I should say, I thought I should bring one of you, but yesterday I was focusing on laundry instead of...
Oh, thank you very much. It's so exciting to see what the outcome will be in the discussions in the EU Commission about the law and the regulations. A very small question, otherwise we need to continue. Yes? The microphone.
I think there's one question in front of me, and I think that's more important, so I'll rest my case.
Okay.
Okay. No, then the question is like this. Have you
Hello. A question about this CRISPR. Have you tried it on grains?
On grains?
Yes.
Well,
Not we take it as a non-official answer. So
you mean
like wheat
grain
and stuff?
crops, wheat.
Yes.
Yeah. We haven't done it,
No.
but others have doing it.
Okay.
So it works perfectly fine.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
So, thank you once again. Thank you. We will continue, and now we have now heard what we can create or contribute to a sustainable agriculture globally. What can we do for thing to come closer to a sustainable agriculture? But the question is this also valid for Sweden? And I'm thinking of differences in climate and society, and so I will say welcome to Professor Lars Andersson, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Lars has been responsible for a research program called Future Agriculture, and he will now present his views on sustainable agriculture from a Swedish perspective. Where are we now, and where we might be in 2030 or in the future?
Yeah.
So, the floor is yours.
So, let me see if I can. Jag tror det fixar sig. Ja. That should be me. Ja, just det. Jag har inte glasögon. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I promised I would say something about Swedish agriculture and sustainability, and what would be a vision for Swedish agriculture in 2030. So, but what is sustainability and how does it apply to agriculture? I found this one, which I think is really good in a way. All farmers I met, I think, would agree about this. Meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. All farmers want the next generation, the ones who take over the farms, to have the same possibility, have the same quality of the soil, good economy at the farm, to take over and live on the land the same way they have done, or better even. So, but the question is, does this work also at a larger scale? How sustainable is agriculture, is Swedish agriculture? If it isn't, how should we change it? Last week, we were able to read the long-waited for aims of the Swedish food strategy. And some key words there are competitive food chain, total increase of food production, increased self-sufficiency, meeting consumers' demands, reduced vulnerability. Is this possible to combine with environmental goals? Is it possible that this could be done in a sustainable way? Well, it says in the overall aims that this should be done taking in consideration the environmental goals. The generation goal, which is a sort of also a way of describing sustainability. The overall goal of environmental policy is to hand over to the next generation, here it comes again, a society in which the major environmental problems have been solved without increasing environmental and health problems outside Swedish borders. So is it possible to make this, to combine, to get an increase of food production and still meet the environmental goals? Another thing which is very important when we talk about sustainability is climate change and Sweden's commitment to live up to the Paris Agreement. Last summer, we were able to read the report from the cross-party committee on environmental objectives, what we call Miljömålsberedningen. And they state clearly, they suggest that Sweden, by the year 2045, will have no net emissions of greenhouse gases. And that calls for rather drastic changes in society as a whole and in agriculture. Because they also conclude that the sector where it probably is most difficult to adapt to this goal is the agricultural sector, for different reasons. Agriculture contributes with 14% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's most of that is methane from animal production, and it's nitrous gas, nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen turnover in the soil. So that must be reduced. And the committee suggests, for example, that organic soil should be transformed into wetlands, which seems rather drastic. And also we should eat less meat, particularly beef. The consumers should change their consumer behavior. But a very important part of that, because that is about reducing the impact of agriculture or food production. But a very important part also is that agriculture can play a very positive, significantly positive role when it comes to mitigation of climate change. And that is by carbon sequestration in soils. That's a very important part of mitigation. But there's also a balance, of course, between the inputs of carbon, the binding of carbon, and the composition of carbon, which means that which adds to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that's a very delicate balance, and that's something which calls for specific management in agriculture. It means cultivating catch crops, using intercropping. It means higher yields, more biomass, which can bind the carbon to the soil via the roots. So it calls for rather large changes in agriculture. I think that's more or less what I said. But so Swedish agriculture today, how does that live up to the sustainability and environmental goals? Well, we have 2.6 million hectares, 3 million if we include the pasture land also. 70% of that is organic. And if we look at the crops we grow, 44%, something like that, consists of lay crops or green fodder. So a large part of arable land is cultivated with perennial crops. Cereals, that's the second largest part, 40%. So just looking at that, just looking at the distribution of crops on the land would tell us that it would be possible to have a very good crop rotation with perennial crops in the cropping sequence. It doesn't look like that because, as you know, there is an uneven distribution in the country. So we have large part of farms in the plains in southern Sweden, in Västergötland, Östergötland, Mälardalen, where the farmers don't have a lay crop in their crop sequence, while other farms who have a lot. So it looks better than it is. Animals, we have around 340,000 dairy cows, 1.5 million pigs, just as an information. If we compare Swedish agriculture with other countries, pesticide sale could be said to be a good indicator of the interest for environment in a country. As you see here, Swedish farmers use far less pesticides than their colleagues in EU as a whole, and in this case Germany and UK. And that goes for all the Nordic countries. Another interesting indicator is the sales of antibiotics to animals. This is milligram per population correction unit, which is the weight of the animals in the country. It's not a perfect measurement, but it clearly shows that Sweden has a very low use of antibiotics for animals. So, looking at this, it seems that Swedish agriculture has come quite a long way when it comes to sustainability and environmental considerations, and in this case also animal welfare. Let's look more into the different challenges for different cultivation system. Conventional farming is highly dependent on pesticides, despite that we use quite less pesticides in Sweden than in other countries. The conventional cereal grower is highly dependent on pesticides. 90-95% of all winter wheat is treated with herbicides, for example. And this has been questioned for reasons that pesticides affect biodiversity, pesticide residues, etc., for environmental reasons. But the interesting thing is that it's also questioned by farmers themselves, by advisors, by researchers, and, interestingly enough, by the agrochemical industry. They question the use of or the dependence on pesticides. And this is the reason why. This is the development of herbicide resistance. We talk a lot about antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which affects the human health. But of course, we have the same problem when it comes to pesticides. This is herbicides, and we have more or less the same situation for some insecticides, for example. This is causing a large problems in countries like the UK, where wheat growers now have to change their crop sequence. Some farmers are growing spring wheat instead of winter wheat because they have no herbicides left to control a weed called blackgrass. Herbicide resistance is increasing in Sweden as well. And all partners, including the agrochemical industry, realizes that it's not sustainable to continue using herbicides in the same way as farmers have done. And that's why the EU directive, which deals with integrated pest management, is accepted by farmers, by advisors, etc., and agrochemical industry. And that means including in the strategy crop sequence, drainage of soil, everything you can do to increase the competitiveness and the strength of a crop. And of course, non-chemical control methods, etc. So, highly dependent on pesticides, suboptimal carbon sequestration due to periods of bare ground, bare soil, low organic inputs. As I said, not so many farmers are using lay crops. We could use more intercropping, catch crops, etc. Greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient leaching, energy demanding, both for heavy machinery, large heavy machinery, and also for the production of fertilizers. And labor recruitment. In some parts, farmers are saying that they have difficulties finding labor workers, farm workers. So what about organic farming? Same thing, actually. Suboptimal carbon sequestration, but in this case due to low yields. Organic farmers often have both lay crops, grass clover crops, which of course is a good thing because it increases the carbon in the soil. But the low yields means that we are not using in an optimum way the possibility to bind carbon in the soil. And the reason for this is pathogens, weeds, insects, difficulty to control them because of no pesticides, and also lack of nutrients. And as you can see there, I put a figure there showing the yield for some crops in Sweden 2015. It looks the same if you go further back. Crop like field beans, more or less the same yield. Otherwise, it's around 60-65%. Greenhouse gas emissions, the same thing as with conventional farming. Nutrient leaching, energy demanding. If you can't control perennial weeds with pesticide herbicides, you have to use quite intensive mechanical weeding. Regulations that are not always optimum. And the low market volume. It's increasing, but it's still only 7% of the food we buy, which is organic. So, the vision for Swedish agriculture 2030. Organic or conventional? Sustainable agriculture, I think. Hopefully, 2030, well, that's a vision. We don't talk about conventional organic, we talk about sustainable agriculture. Because if conventional agriculture is getting closer to organic as it is, at some point the consumer will not pay more for organic. And so how does it need to change? Well, sustainable agriculture, it has to be able to produce enough food, of course, for a growing population. And that means that we probably have to maintain rather high yields, but it also means that consumers have to change their behavior and buy less meat, especially beef. Climate smart. We have to use the potential of the soil to bind carbon. With perennial crops, we catch crops, and by maintaining the high yields. Good animal welfare. Again, that's up to the consumers' priorities. Sweden has probably the best animal welfare in Europe, but farmers are not paid enough for that. And we import a lot because consumers buy the rather cheap imported meat. No chemical residues. IPM, integrated pest management. We have to use all the tools, both the indirect and direct control measures. We've got good crop sequences and mechanical weeding, etc. New technology. If you think about the automatic lawn mower you have in your garden, and picture that instead in the field, controlling, picking the weeds, using GPS, image analysis, it's solar driven. That's on the market already for some crops. Plant breeding, using modern methods for plant breeding so we can get tolerant or resistant crops, resistant to different diseases and pest insects. Nutrient efficiency. We have to be better on recycling of nutrients, taking care of the waste, the human waste in the society, getting it back to the fields. But that's difficult. I mean, getting all that stuff from Stockholm out to the agricultural fields is difficult. We have to find methods to process and concentrate nutrients and make it possible to get it back to the fields. So we need new technology for that, and that is something which is coming already. Fossil-free fertilizers to support that, which if we can't fix all the get all nutrients back, or fix enough nitrogen, we have to support that with fossil-free fertilizers, commercial fertilizers. Biodiversity, diverse cropping systems, and no or few pesticides. And, not the least, agriculture has to be profitable. It has to be attractive. Farmers must be able to live on their farms, and they must be able to attract labor, farm workers. So it's a question of education, supervision, research. But it's also a question of attitudes. How do we convince young people that it's interesting to work in agriculture and to live in the countryside? So, attractive rural society, that's a very important thing also. So, thank you very much, and please take a look at our homepage, Future Agriculture.
And as I can see, there many of your conclusions is that we can is in line what you said, Professor John Reganol. So you described the actual situation, and you took it a step further to the 2030. So thank you. Actually, I think we continue now, and now we come to the end, and we looking forward to have some reflections from a farmer. The farm we will hear about is the organic dairy cooperative 7 gårdar in Uppland, which is a current example of organic farming and a producer of locally produced dairy products. And Elisabeth Goffin is one of the initiators, and she has been the former vice chairman of the Swedish Farmers Federation. And we are looking forward to hear some of your thoughts about you have heard, and also which challenges and what demands you have for the future. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Well, I don't have a slideshow, so we save some minutes there, I think. We're running a little bit late, but I hope you have time to stay and listen. I'm very happy to be here and hopefully contribute to this ongoing discussion, which will not finish by today, so let's keep it going. Inger, you presented myself, so I don't have to get into that. But this would probably be more of a practical perspective than scientific. Most of what we are doing on our farm and on the other farms in 7 gårdar, 7 farm cooperative, is based on ancient history and knowledge about the nature and agriculture and practical experiences. But of course, also modern technology and practical and innovations. But sometimes it's very much about trial and error, and learn by doing the really hard way if you are a farmer. As Inger pointed out, I have been engaged in many organizations in farming, both nationally and internationally. And right now, I'm also the president of KRAV, which you might have heard of, perhaps not you, John, but that is our organic organization which work with developing the organic market together with members, partners, farmers, and others. And with the EU standard as a base, we work out requirements that are also a little bit higher on certain key areas like animal welfare, health, climate change, and social responsibility, like you were mentioning, in aim to strengthen sustainability in all dimensions. And I think that is a little bit what we are talking about here. KRAV also function as a supporter to farmers, organic farmers, but also to those who want to convert. Back home at Stubby, our farm, 2 of our children are run the farm since 2010, so I'm actually the senior, not the practical farmer anymore. The farm holds about 400 hectares. We keep about around 200 dairy cows and 150 hectares of pasture, and the cows produce, in average, a little bit over 10,000 kilos of energy-corrected milk. We have not been organic that many years. We converted the whole farm 2006. We started off 1989 with some part of the land we were a little bit not so brave at that time. And before that, we were just regular commercial farmers with the dairy, with the plant production, crops mainly for the cows. But we were also strawberry growers. We produced strawberries in large scale. But when we converted the farm, we put that to an end because we couldn't really figure out to do that successfully. A few years later, I went to Costa Rica, and that was when I was a member of the board of SEC, now called We Effect. And we were visiting some of the projects down there. And I met a farmer. He was called Hota Hota, but I think it was a short for Juan Jose. And he wasn't just a farmer. Years back, he had connected with some Japanese advisors who were very skilled in organic. And they taught him everything they knew, and since then he learned a lot more. And when I met him, he was not only a farmer, he was an advisor himself and a manager of this cooperative. And somebody who actually, as people came traveling to from all over the world, from Harvard University and other universities, and people who took an interest in organic movement and wanted to learn more about how to be successful in organic production. They all went to Costa Rica. And these farmers, they sold their products through the cooperative to Walmart. And it was a fantastic experience for me to see this very productive site and all the farmers that were working there, and they were very skilled. And it wasn't just a tiny business of no importance. It made difference to so many in so many different ways. I think that was a bit of what you brought up, the need for actually the social side of sustainability. And they had a very holistic view on their doings. So when he was offering me fresh, red, big strawberries, I couldn't stop myself from telling him about our failures with the strawberries back home. And he turned to me and looked at me and said, "Well, then you didn't work with nature." And I have been trying to figure out what he meant, and I cannot say that I fully reached the answer, but it would be a big lie to say that. But I have learned a lot since. And that sustainable food production and agriculture is not just one fits all, one system. And organic production is one way of working with sustainability. And there are many other ways, like we have heard today. And a lot of farmers, scientists, people who are interested and engaged in these, they make moves every day. But there is a long way to go, and before we can truly say that agriculture and food production is sustainable. And that goes for all production systems, as organic as well as others. And you, Lars, you pointed out what actually sustainable means, so I don't get into that. Now I will tell you a little bit about 7 farms, but I wanted to make this introduction for you. 7 farms, we were just regular organic farmers, dairy farmers outside Uppsala. We started off our initiative 8 years ago because we saw the market opportunity of being both local and organic. And we wanted to gain from that, and we were not all that grounded in sustainable dimensions. So our drivers at that time was mainly economics, I'd say. But with a lot of help from people outside, and we managed to launch our first product in February 2009. And very soon after our introduction in the market, we got competitions from others. So we realized if we were going to stay in position, we needed to develop our business idea. So we got ourselves involved in a project, working with climate change and trying to reduce the impact on farm level, which is actually the big part when we talk on climate impact on a dairy farm. The project was run by Swedish Seal and Krav, and to cut a long story short, it really has been a long story. It means that we on farm level, apart from the regular organic Krav rules and regulations, also have to apply to a special scheme concentrating on the energy use, animal health, use of nutrients on the farm, plant rotation and feed production to make be more self-sufficient in that. And that altogether can actually make a difference. And I wouldn't say it's not very much, but if you are working hard, you can perhaps reach 10% in climate impact. 2010 we got certified. It has been quite a journey, I'd say, and we haven't through the years been 100% sure that this was the right step to take. But it has been a lot of work and a lot of documentation. But we have stayed in position in the market, which has been good for us. And also we can actually now, 6 years after we started, see some results, even if they are not scientifically based. But the wrong calculating we have done the same all the years through. So what we can conclude is that we actually have reduced the energy use per kilo energy corrected milk with around 25%, actually a little bit more. And we're saving around 7 liters of diesel per hectare. And we have increased the self-sufficient in feed production. So in average, it's over 80%, and some of the farms are over 90%. Altogether, it has led to that the group is become more efficient, a lot wiser, and I think actually a little bit better farmers. And now, is it 8 years? Yes, 8 years. We are also having a better insight in sustainability, and that working in this direction actually can pay off. We have also, through the years, learned that to work with sustainability it's a way to get to the market, but it also makes it more fun to be farming. So we have a cooperation with a honey producer, which he puts out his beehives. We also see, like some of you have been into, the need of research and innovations. We are experiencing droughts and flooding much more than we did before. Also, we are having high-producing animals, and we can see the need for a development in breed for organic production to have them stronger and to be more resilient to heat, for example, which hasn't been a problem for us up till now. But also that the driver is a better economy, because that gives us space to invest and to use new innovations. And that this goes for farmers all over the world. Well, this was just a few examples from our little cooperative and our farm. And this is not, I'd say, it's not limited to organic farming. This is applicable to other type farming systems, of course. And if we look around in the world, we will see millions of examples in the way that we have done. And I think the key to sustainable agriculture and food production is to combine the best practices of, and innovation and apply it on a much more holistic view. It's so easy to sort of end up with that is about wheat per hectare, kilos, so tons of wheat per hectare. Agriculture is such a complex system, so you have to have the whole picture in mind. And when at the end of the day, it is about our future, our livelihood, the limited natural resources we have, the air we are breathing, the water we're drinking, and then the land and the soil we're using and walking upon. That goes for all of us. Finally, I just want to mention, and I think this is aligning very much with what you said, John, that IFOAM has produced a paper quite recently, which they called Organic 3.0 for truly sustainable farming and consumption. And briefly, if Organic 1.0 was the starting point 100 years ago, was more related to pioneers from all over the world who saw connections between the way we lived, the food weight, the way we produce food, our health, and the health of the planet. And if Organic 2.0 is where we are now, it's sort of more into the market, norming, setting standards, regulation, and enable the market for organics. But we have also seen the gaps in production and not being able to meet the demand. So now we need to speed up, and also like some of you also have mentioned, to go into a more to new systems. Organic 3.0 is meant to have a broader and more holistic perspective, but also bring in the other dimensions. So, I will just quote some of the targets that we are 3.0 is saying. That is, for example, to go from organic standard compliance to continuous improvement towards best practice across comprehensive set of sustainable dimensions. It's also to go from certification only to multiple options for building trust and security, and to go from organic as an objective to sustainable development in food and farming value chains, and to go from excluding the non-compliant to including aspiring stakeholders in the whole value chain, and to go from quality focus only to quality products whilst addressing global challenges, and to go from demonstrating technologies to innovations appropriate for widespread applications, and to go from celebrating philosophy, which is also we can be, well, not banned for being organic, but to go to developing policies to make organic to a bigger scale, and to go from price premia for good to fair price based on true cost accounting of all positive and negative externalities that, like you, John, were into also. So this was just a quote from that paper. But back to Juan Jose, I just wanted to finalize by saying that not only did their work generate value and products giving fair prices and stable way to the market, it also stimulated growth, and a variety of crops generated work for both women and men. And it improved their livelihood and health, not using pesticides and chemicals, and instead using microbes provided by nature. And they were also connected to others outside and inside Costa Rica and all over the world, sharing their experiences and knowledge with us coming to see them. And I think this was what Juan Jose talked about when he said to me, "Then you didn't work with nature." And I think he did. And thank you for listening. Gonzalo, we ran out of time.
So, thank you very much. And now we have a question. Erik.
Thank you so much. If you now represent those with the feet deep in the soil, Elisabeth, what information, what knowledge, what new research areas do you lack most to make the Swedish farmers and farming systems sustainable in a true way?
Well, I think climate change is one of the big concerns in a long-term perspective, and I don't think we fully get that into the picture. Social responsibility, I think that is also an area that needs to dig into, because we can see that in other fields, I mean, in the industries, and how to pay, how to reward people. You talked about retirement systems. We are pretty ahead, I think, but we are also facing the competition outside Sweden. So we need to be, if we're going to stay competitive, we need to also be socially responsible, and so have a social sustainability so I think that there are two fields that I can come up with right now.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear that if you're talking about sustainable agriculture, I think we have come, all of you who have talked here, come to the same conclusion, that is a mixed, a blend of different systems who will be the result. It is not the one or the other, it is a combination. So we can get the sustainable agriculture. Any last question? Otherwise, I will say that we have one. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Björn Frostell. I am a professor emeritus from KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, and have not been working with agriculture at all, but lately with aquaculture. My background is as a scientist in industrial ecology, system science, trying to understand resource flows in society. And I would like to just, with the best aims, to give a little bit of another perspective on the things, the theme of tonight. And it is to simply raise another question. And that is, if we say sustainable agriculture, what is it today and what is it in the future? And then from an industrial ecology perspective, so we would say, how could we feed an increasing world population in a sustainable way? Mm-hmm. And if you do this, you would not only work with and discuss agriculture, you would in an increasing way also discuss aquaculture, introduce it, and an integration, and perhaps also horticulture, where aquaculture and horticulture today can be performed from a technological point of view in a much more controlled way than agriculture, because they are more closed systems. And as an example, so I can mention that in a recycling aquaculture system that we have out in Ljusterö outside Stockholm, so we could increase the area productivity. If we compare with the fish catch in the big Swedish Lake Vänern, we could increase the area productivity between 100,000 and 1 million times in such a closed system, without the use of any antibiotics, any types of chemicals, and so on. And if you do this, so you can say that the feed here is the big thing, and that has to a great extent to be produced in conventional or in so to say, organic agriculture, because they need to be more and more vegetarians and so on. If you combine this in our climate with horticulture in greenhouses, you can also increase productivity in a very, very high intensity. So my argument is here that we need to see these things where we can combine different resource flows, including now also the nutrient flows from our bigger and bigger cities. And here I participated 2 years ago in the production of a strategic innovation agenda called Urban Food, where we have developed these ideas a bit more on how you could work in this direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was very Thank you very much for what you have said, and I think that will be could be a continuing coming seminar where we take the wider perspective. Today it was sustainable agriculture, because we need to have sustainable agriculture as well, even though we talk about it in a wider perspective. So, but thank you anyhow. I think we have come to the end of this seminar. I think we have gained new knowledge, deeper understanding, and we have heard that we are from the speakers that we are come to the same conclusion in many ways. And we also know that we have many challenges in the future. I will also take the opportunity to announce our next seminar on this topic at KSLA, named Sustainable Agriculture 4.0, at February 16th. Welcome to read more about it on KSLA's website. So now it's a short pause, and then a dinner for those who have said okay to that. And at last, I suggest we give all the speakers a big hand.